$2,000 says the little lady can't even hold the damn rifle steady, let alone pull the trigger. The Delta operator's laugh echoed across the desolate firing range. He expected her to walk away. Instead, she pointed at a flickering candle nearly 2 miles downrange. "Make it 3, she whispered. The wind howling across the Camp Guernsey Joint Training Center in Wyoming carried the bitter bite of an early November frost. It was an unforgiving landscape of sagebrush, jagged limestone, and endless, mocking distance. For the men of the United States military's elite Tier 1 units, it was the perfect playground. But for Chief Petty Officer Rachel Hollister, it was a crucible. Rachel was an anomaly, a statistical impossibility walking among giants. Earning the Trident as a Navy SEAL had been a grueling defiance of every expectation. But earning her classification as a Tier 1 sniper had painted a permanent target on her back. She wasn't built like a comic book superhero. She was wiry, standing at 5'7", composed entirely of lean muscle, quiet observation, and cold, terrifying patience. Her hands bore the permanent calluses of a life spent gripping coarse steel and dragging her body weight through mud. But to the uninitiated eye, she didn't look like the deadliest asset on the base. That Friday evening, the tension inside the makeshift base cantina, a reinforced Quonset hut smelling heavily of stale coffee, gun oil, and unwashed tactical gear, was palpable. A detachment from the Army's Delta Force had arrived for a joint operations exercise. Elite units rarely mix without friction. When alpha mentalities collide in a confined space, egos become fragile and posturing becomes inevitable. Holding court at the center table was Master Sergeant Thomas Reddick. Reddick was a legend in his own mind and a terror on the battlefield, a massive, broad-shouldered operator from Texas who had spent the last decade kicking down doors in places that didn't exist on official maps. He was currently detailing a recent 1,200-meter shot he'd made in the mountains of the Hindu Kush, exaggerating the wind call for the benefit of his captive audience. Rachel sat quietly in the corner, nursing a lukewarm bottle of sparkling water, reviewing a topographical map. Beside her sat her spotter, Petty Officer Second Class David Mitchell, a meticulous math prodigy who trusted Rachel more than he trusted gravity. "It's all about the physical mass of the shooter," Reddick boomed, his voice carrying easily over the low hum of the generator outside. He slapped his meaty hand on the table. "You put a lightweight on a heavy anti-material rifle. The recoil anticipation ruins the shot before the firing pin even strikes. It's physics. You need the body mass to absorb the shock, to hold the chassis dead still." He turned his gaze deliberately toward Rachel's corner. A heavy silence rippled through the room. The Delta guys smirked. The SEALs in the room stiffened. "Take our Navy friend over there," Reddick continued, clearly looking for a fight to break the boredom of the Wyoming deployment. "No disrespect, Chief, but physics is physics. You put a custom .416 Barrett in her hands. The sheer weight of the platform is going to cause muscle tremors. 2, maybe 3 minutes on the glass, and she wouldn't be able to hold the gun steady enough to hit the broad side of a barn. It's a biological limitation." Rachel didn't look up from her map. She simply traced a contour line with her pen. "Physics is physics, Sergeant," she replied, her voice soft but carrying a sharp, metallic edge. "But marksmanship is discipline. Muscle mass doesn't do the math." Reddick stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. He walked over to her table, towering over her. "Math doesn't pull the trigger while 70 pounds of weapon system is trying to crush your collarbone." He reached into his tactical vest, pulled out a thick wad of $100 bills and slammed it onto her topographical map. $2,000, Reddick sneered. $2,000 says you can't even hold my custom point, 416 steady on a bipod for 5 minutes and hit a standard steel torso at 1,000 meters. Not with this crosswind. The gun will own you. Mitchell shifted nervously. Back off, Reddick. You're drunk on your own ego. Rachel slowly placed her pen down. She looked at the money, then looked up, meeting Reddick's gaze with eyes that were terrifyingly calm. They were the eyes of a predator analyzing prey. 1,000 meters is a pistol shot. Sergeant, Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. And steel is boring. She stood up, pushing the table slightly to give herself space. Keep your 2,000, but I'll tell you what. Tomorrow evening, at dusk, we take the rifle out to the flatline ridge. You set up a target. Reddick crossed his arms. What target? A candle, Rachel said evenly. Laughter erupted from the Delta operators behind Reddick. Even Reddick chuckled, shaking his head. A candle at 1,000 meters, you're insane. Not 1,000, Rachel corrected, her expression entirely devoid of humor. 2,000, 720 meters. The room went dead silent. The generator outside seemed to hum louder. 2,000. 720 meters. That was 1.69 miles. At that distance, the curvature of the Earth became a serious factor. The flight time of the bullet would be agonizingly long. The target wouldn't even be a shape. It would be a microscopic distortion of light. You're out of your mind, Reddick said, his smile vanishing. The world record is in that neighborhood, and that was against an insurgent on a clear day, not a 2-inch flame in the Wyoming wind. If I miss, Rachel said, leaning in slightly, or if my arms shake, or if I can't hold your precious gun steady, I resign my classification, hand you my trident, and walk away from the teams. But if I extinguish that flame... She tapped the stack of bills on the table. You match this. $4,000 to the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society. And you publicly admit, on video, that Delta Force just got schooled by a biological limitation. Reddick's jaw tightened. His pride had been called out in front of 2 different elite units. There was no backing down now. You're on Hollister, but you're using my rifle, and I pick the candle. The following evening, the sky over Camp Guernsey bruised into deep shades of purple and charcoal. The wind, which had been a steady 15 knots all day, began to gust erratically, whipping loose dirt into blinding little dust devils. Word of the wager had spread like wildfire. By 1800 hours, nearly 50 operators, instructors, and base command staff had gathered at the flatline ridge. It felt less like a military exercise and more like a gladiatorial arena. Reddick had spared no expense in trying to rig the game. He and his team had driven a Humvee out precisely 2,720 meters away, parking it at the base of a rocky berm. On the hood of the vehicle, they placed a standard, cheap paraffin emergency candle, the kind that barely held a flame in a light breeze, let alone the punishing gusts of the Wyoming plains. To ensure the wind didn't blow it out before the shot, they fashioned a small, 3-sided plexiglass shield around it. The front, however, was completely exposed to the firing line. Back on the ridge, Mitchell was a nervous wreck. He had spent the last 3 hours running ballistic software, checking barometric pressure, measuring humidity, and cursing under his breath. "Rachel, listen to me," Mitchell hissed, adjusting the massive spotting scope mounted on a heavy-duty tripod. The bullet drop at 2,720 meters with the point, 416 Barrett is astronomical. We are talking about over 350 feet of drop. You basically have to aim at the clouds to hit the ground. I know the math. Dave, Rachel said, calmly stretching her shoulders. She wore standard fatigues and a simple beanie, looking entirely unbothered by the cold or the crowd. It's not just the drop, Mitchell insisted, tapping his Kestrel wind meter. The wind is blowing left to right at roughly 12 knots here, but looking at the mirage and the dust downrange, it's funneling through a draw at about 2,000 meters. It's reversing direction. And the flight time, the bullet will be in the air for almost 4 full seconds. In 4 seconds, that candle could burn down, the wind could shift, or the earth will literally rotate. Coriolis effect, Rachel muttered, closing her eyes and visualizing the shot. The earth rotates beneath the bullet while it's in flight, in the northern hemisphere, shooting east. The bullet will strike high and to the right. Exactly, Mitchell said, running a hand over his face. You have to account for spin drift from the rifling, aerodynamic jump, the barometric pressure dropping because of this storm front moving in. Rachel, the target is a flame. It's not solid matter. If you hit the wax, it's a miss. You have to put the round through the wick to extinguish the fire without destroying the candle. Then I'll shoot the wick, she said simply. Reddick approached, carrying a massive Pelican case. He unlatched it and kicked the lid open, revealing the beast. It was a customized .416 Barrett anti-materiel rifle. It was a devastating piece of machinery, almost 5 feet long, weighing nearly 35 pounds fully loaded. It was designed to disable light-armored vehicles, not to perform microsurgery at 2 miles. Here she is, Reddick said. A smug grin plastered across his face. 35 pounds of unforgiving steel. You sure you don't want a step stool? Chief. Rachel ignored the taunt. She walked over to the weapon, her eyes scanning its mechanics. She didn't just look at it, she communicated with it. She checked the heavy bolt, feeling the tension of the spring. She inspected the massive muzzle brake, designed to vent expanding gases and reduce the bone-crushing recoil. Mount it, she told Reddick. Reddick scoffed, but hauled the rifle over to the firing mat, deploying the heavy bipod legs. He settled it into the dirt. It's zeroed at 100 meters. The optic is a Nightforce Attica. You have a maximum of 40 minutes of angle in the elevation turret for a 2,720-meter shot. I'll have to hold over, Rachel finished for him, and use the reticle grid. I know. She lowered herself onto the mat. The moment her body touched the ground, the quiet, unassuming chief petty officer vanished. Her breathing slowed to a rhythmic, barely perceptible cadence. She slid behind the weapon, tucking the heavy stock firmly into the pocket of her shoulder. She let her cheek rest against the cold comb of the stock. The crowd behind them fell silent. The only sound was the howling wind and the distant rumble of the approaching storm. Through the optic, the world was a blur of grey and brown. She dialed the magnification up, fighting through the thick soup of atmospheric distortion and heat mirage. It took her almost a full minute just to find the Humvee, a tiny, pixelated speck on the horizon. And there, resting on the hood, was a microscopic, flickering dot of orange. The candle. I have visual, Rachel said, her voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion. Time is 1845, Mitchell said, his eye glued to the spotting scope. Wind at the muzzle is full value, 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock, gusting to 15 knots. At mid-range, it's a half-value wind from the right. It's a blender out there. Rach. Suddenly, a heavy drop of water hit the back of Rachel's neck. Then another hit the steel barrel of the Barrett. Reddick barked a laugh. Rain unbelievable. Mother Nature wants you to fail. Hollister, the bet was you take the shot. If the rain puts that candle out before you pull the trigger, you forfeit. Mitchell panicked. Rachel, the barometric pressure is plummeting. The air density is changing as we speak. My dope data on previous engagements is out the window. You have to take the shot now, or the math is useless. Rachel didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stared through the glass, her finger resting lightly on the outside of the trigger guard. 35 pounds of rifle pushed against her, demanding strength, but she offered it something better, perfect, unyielding equilibrium. Hold, Rachel whispered. Rachel. The rain. I said hold. David. She was watching the mirage, the subtle waves of heat rising from the cooling earth. She was reading the invisible currents of the air. She wasn't fighting the environment. She was becoming part of it. The wind howled, a savage gust tearing across the firing line, threatening to rip the beanie from her head. But the heavy chassis of the .416 Barrett, resting against her shoulder, did not move a single millimeter. The rain didn't fall, it spat. Cold. Heavy droplets struck the dry Wyoming dirt, kicking up the sharp, ozone scent of wet sage and dust. Beside Rachel, Petty Officer David Mitchell wiped a desperate hand across the objective lens of his spotting scope, cursing violently under his breath. I'm losing the mirage. Rachel, Mitchell said, his voice tight with rising panic. The rain is washing out the thermal differential. The temperature just dropped 4 degrees in 90 seconds. Density altitude is plummeting. You need to come up another half milliradian on your elevation. And the wind, hell, the wind is doing whatever it wants. It's a complete gamble now. Behind them, Master Sergeant Thomas Reddick stood with his arms crossed, a smug, immovable object. He was surrounded by his Delta operators, Sergeant First Class Miller, Specialist Jenkins, and a heavily bearded breacher named O'Connor. They were grinning. The environment had rigged the bet in their favor. To them, Rachel Hollister wasn't just fighting the rifle or the distance anymore. She was fighting God. Call it. Chief. Reddick projected over the howling wind. No shame in backing down from a statistical impossibility. The rain's gonna put that candle out before you even touch the trigger, and you forfeit. Rachel tuned him out. She tuned Mitchell out. She retreated into the quiet, isolated room in her mind, where only geometry, gravity, and the target existed. She adjusted her breathing, inhaling slowly through her nose, feeling the chill of the air expand her diaphragm, then releasing it in a measured, controlled sigh. Through the Night Force Atacroptic, the world was a violently shifting canvas of greys and browns. At 2,720 meters, the target vehicle was smaller than the head of a pin, the tiny, erratic speck of orange light. The candle was a ghost, appearing and disappearing behind a curtain of falling rain and blowing dust. She didn't touch the elevation turret. She wouldn't rely on mechanical adjustments for a shot this dynamic. She used the Horus reticle, a complex grid etched into the glass, mentally calculating her holdover. She needed to aim practically off the glass, aiming at a piece of empty, turbulent sky dozens of feet above the actual target and several feet to the left to let the wind push the massive .416 caliber bullet back into the center. Rachel, Mitchell whispered, his voice cracking. I can't see the flame. The rain is too thick. I have no visual. I have it, she breathed. It was a lie. but a necessary one. She didn't see the flame. She saw the rhythm of its flicker from a moment ago. She felt the wind across the back of her exposed neck. It was surging, then dipping, pulsing like a heartbeat. She waited for the dip. 3, 2. The wind momentarily stalled, drawing in a sharp breath before the next savage gust. The rain suspended for a fraction of a second. Rachel reached the natural respiratory pause at the bottom of her exhale. Her heart rate plummeted to 40 beats per minute for that single, solitary second. The 35 pounds of heavy steel resting against her shoulder wasn't a biological limitation. It was an extension of her own skeleton. She applied 3 pounds of pressure to the trigger. The sear broke like a glass rod. The concussion was apocalyptic. A jet of fire and expanding gases erupted from the muzzle brake, violently kicking up a cloud of wet mud and dust in a 10-foot radius. The massive recoil punched into Rachel's shoulder with the force of a swinging sledgehammer. To the shock of every Delta operator watching, her body absorbed it flawlessly. She didn't flinch. She didn't close her eyes. She drove her shoulder forward, riding the recoil pulse straight back down, keeping her eye glued to the scope to watch the trace. The solid brass, 400-grain bullet left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second. It shattered the sound barrier instantly, a deafening crack echoing across the flatline ridge. Then began the agonizing wait. 1 second. The bullet was crossing the 800-meter mark, slicing through the rain, fighting the aerodynamic drag that was desperately trying to claw it out of the sky. 2 seconds. It was bleeding velocity, dropping subsonic. At 1,600 meters, the right-to-left wind caught it, pushing it off its central axis. The spin drift from the rifle's twist rate pulled it further right. 3 seconds. It was entering the draw, 2,200 meters out. The unpredictable, swirling winds grabbed the projectile, threatening to toss it completely off course. Gravity was pulling it down at an exponential rate. It was no longer flying. It was falling out of the sky in a massive, parabolic arc. 4 seconds. Through the spotting scope. Mitchell held his breath. The silence on the ridge was suffocating. Every man stood frozen, their eyes locked on the distant horizon. Through Rachel's optic, a tiny splash of water and pulverized rock erupted behind the distant Humvee. Then, the microscopic speck of orange light vanished. "Impact!" Mitchell gasped, his voice trembling. I lost the flame. The light is gone." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reddick stepped forward, aggressively snatching his own spotting scope from its case and throwing it onto a tripod. He squinted through the glass, his face tight with denial. "The wind blew it out," Reddick declared, his voice loud but laced with a sudden, sharp insecurity. "The rain put it out. There is absolutely no way she hit that. It was a 4-second flight time in a rainstorm." She missed, and the weather did the rest. Rachel calmly flipped the safety on the massive Barrett. She rolled off the rifle, standing up and brushing the wet Wyoming mud from her fatigues. She looked at Reddick, her expression entirely unreadable. "Let's go check," she said. The drive out to the 2,720-meter mark took almost 10 minutes. Reddick drove his Humvee like a madman, tearing over the uneven terrain. His jaw clenched so hard, the muscles jumped beneath his skin. Rachel sat in the passenger seat, staring calmly out the rain-streaked window. In the back, Mitchell, Miller, and Jenkins rode in a tense, suffocating silence. No one spoke. The arrogance that had filled the Quonset hut the night before had completely evaporated, replaced by a heavy, anxious dread. Reddick slammed on the brakes as they approached the target Humvee, parked against the limestone berm. The rain was beginning to clear, leaving a heavy mist hanging in the cold air. He threw the door open and marched toward the hood of the parked vehicle. The plexiglass shield was still standing, dotted with water droplets. Inside the makeshift shelter sat the cheap paraffin candle. It was unlit. A thin wisp of white smoke was still curling up from the center. "See," Reddick barked, pointing a thick, triumphant finger at the candle. He turned to Rachel, a cruel smile returning to his face. "The wax is completely intact. The candle isn't shattered. You missed the target. Hollister. The rain got it. Just like I said. You owe me $2,000, and you owe the teams your trident." Mitchell hurried over, his heart sinking. He looked at the candle. The white wax cylinder was perfectly whole. There was no crater, no shatter marks, no indication of a high-velocity impact. Reddick was right. If a .416 round had hit the candle, it would have vaporized the wax and likely punched a hole straight through the hood of the Humvee. "Damn it," Mitchell whispered, dropping his head. Rachel didn't say a word. She walked slowly up to the hood of the vehicle. She didn't look at the wax. She leaned in close, inspecting the top of the candle. Then, she reached into her pocket, pulled out a small tactical flashlight, and clicked it on, shining the bright white beam directly onto the top of the wax. "Sergeant Reddick," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the damp air like a scalpel. "Take a closer look." Reddick scoffed but stepped closer, leaning over her shoulder. Miller and Jenkins crowded in behind them. Illuminated by the harsh glare of the flashlight was the top of the candle. The wax was indeed perfectly intact. But the wick, the tiny, braided string that had held the flame, was gone. It hadn't burned down. It hadn't been snuffed out by a raindrop. It had been severed cleanly, sheared off flush with the surface of the wax, leaving a microscopic, blackened stump. "Look behind it," Rachel instructed softly. Reddick slowly raised his eyes. On the back wall of the three-sided plexiglass shield, directly behind where the wick had been, was a massive, jagged hole. Embedded deep into the steel hood hinge behind the plexiglass was the mangled, copper-jacketed remains of a 400-grain .416 bullet. The silence that fell over the group was absolute. It was the kind of silence that accompanies the shattering of a worldview. She hadn't just hit the target. She hadn't just missed the wax to avoid destroying the candle. Rachel Hollister had fired a 35-pound rifle through a torrential downpour, calculated the curvature of the earth, the barometric pressure, and a shifting crosswind over a distance of nearly 1.7 miles. And she had literally shot the burning wick off the candle without scratching the wax beneath it. It was an impossible shot, a shot that defied the laws of probability. Specialist Jenkins slowly took off his cap, running a hand through his hair. "Mother of God," he whispered reverently. Reddick stood frozen, staring at the severed wick. His chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. The towering, unshakable Delta operator looked suddenly very small. The biological limitation had just delivered a masterclass in lethal precision that he couldn't replicate if he lived 1,000 years. Rachel clicked her flashlight off and slid it back into her pocket. She turned to face Reddick, her demeanor unchanged from the moment she had accepted the bet in the cantina. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She was a professional collecting a debt. $4,000, Rachel said, her voice steady and calm. To the Navy Marine Corps Relief Society. I expect the transfer receipt emailed to my command by 0800 tomorrow. Reddick swallowed hard, his eyes unable to meet hers. He gave a single, slow nod. You'll have it. And the video, Mitchell chimed in, suddenly finding his courage, a massive grin splitting his face. Don't forget the public admission. Sergeant... Reddick glared at Mitchell, but the fight was completely gone from him. He looked back at Rachel, a newfound, grudging respect settling over his features. He reached out his hand. You hold a rifle just fine, Chief, Reddick said quietly. Rachel looked at his hand for a moment before taking it in a firm grip. Physics is physics. Sergeant. But it's the mind that pulls the trigger. By the next morning, the video of Master Sergeant Thomas Reddick admitting defeat to a Navy SEAL had circulated through every encrypted group chat in the Special Operations community. The legend of Rachel Hollister was permanently cemented. She was no longer an anomaly or a lightweight holding a heavy gun. She was the ghost on the flatline ridge, the woman who shot the fire out of the rain. Did Chief Hollister's impossible shot leave you breathless? The limits of human precision are meant to be broken. If you loved this intense story of grit, undeniable skill, and shattered egos, hit that like button right now. Share this video with anyone who loves military tactical thrills, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more